Mansell, former Thames Valley Police and Crime Commissioner, who has locked horns with the City of London and bankers in the past. I thought it'd be good to invite Anthony because there are lots of issues around, not just about the post office, but there are issues about so many other, what people would say, nefarious, fraudulent practices, which so easily get buried, but they need to be dealt with. So hopefully, we are hoping to organise further events and invite people affected by Grenfell, and other kind of banking fraud, blood infection, many, many other things. And hopefully we would return to those events, and I'm also hoping that we will be able to find a bigger room. So without saying anything else, I ask Anthony to speak. He will speak for about 20-25 minutes, then there will be opportunities for questions and discussion. Thank you, Anthony.
Right, well, we haven't got loudspeakers, and I hope I don't lose my voice, so I hope you can all hear me. And I'll go through this as succinctly as I can. The post office scandal only became apparent to the public when a TV programme was made about it. It'd been known about for years, yet nothing was done. Some postmasters were still being dragged in front of courts and imprisoned. Lives were ruined, and none of them manifestly guilty have been held to account. And very few of the victims paid back the money that the post office had stolen from them. No compensation has been paid. The major banking frauds have many parallels. The main difference is the scale of the money stolen. The post office frauds amounted to probably less than 700 million, and I don't know what the figure is. The banking frauds run into billions and ruined far more people and destroyed a huge number of companies. Both the banking frauds and the post office frauds have been well known about for years, and both are being covered up by the very institutions that should have exposed them. The only bank fraud held to account was the Lloyds HBOS Reading frauds, which were themselves in financial terms larger than the entire post office frauds, though the prosecution was only done on 245 million. The actual frauds were somewhere between 800 million and $1 billion. What was going on at other bank branches, notably out of London, Bristol, Leeds and Edinburgh, were on a far larger scale and have never been properly investigated. I was the Police and Crime Commissioner at the time of the Thames Valley Police prosecutions of the Lloyds HBOS Reading case, but I can take absolutely no credit for that myself. I was fortunate to have an excellent Chief Constable in Sarah Thornton who took on the case. It had been turned down by 2 other police forces and the Serious Fraud Office. If Thames Valley hadn't taken it on, nothing would have been done. The Financial Conduct Authority declined to take any interest. The 6 most directly involved bankers received sentences that amounted to 49 years in the end. But only about a quarter of the fraud was actually prosecuted, and in my view, a lot of the more serious people who knew perfectly well what was going on got away with it. The case cost Thames Valley Police £7 million to bring. The Financial Conduct Authority eventually fined Lloyds an initial 65 million, reduced to 45 million to thank them for their cooperation. Well, they certainly did not cooperate with the Thames Valley Police investigation. Throughout the 3-year investigation, Lloyds steadfastly refused to admit a major fraud had taken place. It was not until the guilty verdicts were returned that Lloyds admitted to frauds they had known about throughout the investigation and trial. I have no doubt about that. The £7 million fine on Lloyds went direct to the Treasury. Absolutely none came back to Thames Valley Police to pay for the investigation, though actually the Home Office came up with, I think, about 1.9 million in the end. I wrote to the then Chancellor, Philip Hammond, and asked the Thames Valley Police to be repaid. I got an unsigned curt letter saying no. The one lesson that came out of the case that it was simply not worth a police force taking on major frauds involving banks. It cannot afford to take on the bank's legal team, such as Herbert Smith Freehills. I had a meeting with the chairman of Lloyds, and that was Lord Blackwell, his executive director, Juan Columbus, and the Lloyds Group lawyer and chief risk officer, Kate Cheetham, in March 2017. The notes of the meeting were taken by my deputy, Matthew Barber, who is the current PCC at Thames Valley. They're worth going through, and I do have them here, and I think it's worth me just talking through them, because at this meeting I was consistently lied to. The meeting held in the chairman's office, that's Lord Blackwell's office, on 8th floor of 25 Gresham Street. Those in attendance were Lord Blackwell, Group Chairman, Juan Columbus, Executive Director, Chief Risk Officer, and Kate Cheetham. We were well received, but it was made immediately clear that the sole topic of the meeting was about the claims of the victims of the HBOS fraud. It was also intimated that any inquiry went beyond that, just the victims. It would take much longer for the victims to be compensated. A clear distinction was made about wrongdoing and criminality. Well, that's a cover-up if ever there was one in the banking world. There was an acceptance of numerous cases of bad practice by HBOS prior to the Lloyds banking group takeover. Well, Lloyds had actually owned it for many years before this story is, but a continued refusal to accept knowledge of criminality. Well, Lloyds denied criminality throughout the court case, if you remember. Lord Blackwell stated on several occasions he had no reason to defend anything that went on in HBOS and would not only cooperate but encourage further inquiries into criminality. Well, I didn't notice any of that happening afterwards. There was a clear case, a desire to compensate victims as soon as possible. Lord Blackwell stated this was his sole concern, and Juan Columbus stated that he expected independent reviews being undertaken to be concluded in a few months. 7 years later, that inquiry is still going on. 7 years later. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Lloyds Banking Group, along with the FCA, have appointed independent review of the 50 or so known cases resulting from the Reading incident. The process of evaluation, the compensation was in two parts: the underlying value of the business at the point they became insolvent in the Reading incident, and the compensation due for distress and loss. Well, there was precious little compensation. The bare minimum was paid out, I can tell you. Lord Blackwell argued that many of the companies were effectively bankrupt at the point of the fraud commencing, and therefore little or no residual value was lost to the shareholders through the fraud. Anthony Stansfield argued that in many cases they became bankrupt through the actions of HBOS. It was also pointed out that much money was lost because of the bank's actions to recover money beyond bankrupting the companies, but in many cases seeking to recover against the assets of the business owners. Well, it's interesting that I think they call it the Bank Support Unit, the BSU, out of Bristol, which was meant to support companies and was not a cost centre meant to make money. It was making a bloody fortune out of the assets of companies it was taking down. I will skip a lot of it, but there was an absolute refusal to admit that the bank was aware of the frauds before the court case was completed. Well, I simply don't believe that. It was well known about within the bank. Anthony Stansfield pointed out there seemed to be irrefutable evidence that many senior executives of both LBG and HBOS were well aware of the fraud since at least 2008. That was challenged. Well, they certainly knew about it. Kate Cheetham claimed that Lloyds Banking Group had always acknowledged that they had lost money but did not wish to present themselves as a victim of fraud. Well, really. Lord Blackwell was specifically asked if he'd read the Sally Marston report, which was commissioned internally by Lloyds Banking Group. He denied being aware of the report. I find that difficult to believe, and certainly had not read it. Both Kate Cheetham and Juan Columbus acknowledged the existence of the report, but denied having read it. Well, for the chief risk officer at Lloyds not to have read it, I would find actually unbelievable. Kate Cheetham originally suggested that Sally Marston was an HBOS employee, and his sense will correct this and point out that she was an LBG employee when she wrote the report. And I won't go on into it, but it was the most extraordinary meeting, and they had every opportunity to come to be honest at it, and I simply don't believe that they were. Now, if a gang raids a bank through the front door and 50,000, 500,000, 50,000 is stolen, the police will be all over it. There'll be blue lights everywhere, great excitement. If somebody steals 50 million through the back door of a bank, precisely nothing is done about it. It is covered up.
Yeah.
And what the police need to realise is not only is it organised, but it is a crime. It is serious organised crime that they're avoiding looking at. No massive bank frauds are now being investigated. The one large fraud that has been taken to a criminal court had to be done privately. The judge castigated both the police and the CPS for not taking on the case. The sum involved was, I think, around 10 million. The man prosecuted was jailed for 9 years. His name comes up in a mass of other cases where huge sums of money have been stolen, far larger than 9 million, in sums into the billions. This name comes up repeatedly. This particular individual had power of attorney over these large estates and companies. The frauds appear to be done in direct collusion with the banks involved and their legal teams. Recently, this individual was made bankrupt while he was in jail. It begs the question where and how the many tens of millions that he probably personally made were squirreled away. The money has clearly been laundered. I doubt the police have even got around to interviewing him in prison about these many far larger frauds that he was involved in. Certainly none of the victims of these frauds have been interviewed by the police. For most of us, in any large transaction, the bank requires to know where the money came from. They'll be all over you wanting to know where the money came from. Banks themselves can move vast sums of money between sort codes without anybody being the wiser, and the money disappears into the Caymans, the Virgin Islands, or Jersey. As far as I know, there is no proper control over this. They're meant to self-control. They clearly don't. A detailed report, called the Lord Turnbull report, was written by a senior bank employee, Sally Masterton, on what had been going on in Lloyds Bank. It was commissioned by Sue Harris, the Lloyds Group Director of Audit. The report lays out in detail the criminal activities within Lloyds. It names the name of several senior directors involved. Sally Masterton was then sacked from her job without proper compensation, and the bank then claimed the report was unauthorised. Well, it was certainly authorised. It was a lie. It took myself and Lord Hollick to insist on a meeting with the Lloyds Bank chairman, Lord Blackwell, before Sally Masterton was eventually compensated properly. Her life had been ruined for 3 years. However, to get compensation, she had to sign a non-disclosure agreement, an NDA. The report was not acted on in spite of ample evidence that was borne out by the ex-boss prosecutions. Every person who was eventually paid back money, the money that was taken from them in the Lloyds H-Boss Reading case, had to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Why should the bank refuse to pay back money to the bank stole unless the victims sign an NDA? And this business of NDAs is absolutely absurd. If you want your money back that we've stolen from you, you've got to sign an NDA. There's something very wrong there. I think this whole business of NDAs needs looking at.
Yeah.
What was going on in Lloyds was also going on in RBS, now called the NatWest Bank, and also in Santander. Surprisingly, and I think it is surprisingly, it does not appear to have been going on in either Barclays or HSBC, though there may have been specific cases where dodgy people within their banks have tried it on, but it was not being done systemically from either of them, as far as I can see, looking at most of the victims. The way the bank frauds operate against both individuals and companies varies, but there are common threads. In most cases, there are clearly forged documents. These were often on bank guarantees. Loans were altered without any authorization. Bank accounts are opened in company or individual names, lent large sums of money at very high interest rates the individual company has absolutely no knowledge of. And I have one actually sitting right in front of me here, which is an interesting one. This is a hedging fund thing that was done on the back of totally forged documents. The person who was supposed to have signed the documents was abroad at the time. £14 million went on this document. £14 million on a totally false document. It took her years, I think it was 9 years, to get hold of this document that the bank had claimed signed it over. And it was quite clear she wasn't in the country when she signed it. And this has gone on a different scale from what we're talking about, the tens of millions, down to the odd, few hundred thousand. But it was being done systemically, the forging of documents. Lloyds have a division called the Bank Support Unit, the BSU, and NatWest RBS, a similar division, it's called their Global Coverage Group. It's a similar division, it's called their Global Coverage Group. Companies with tangible assets are put into these divisions, allegedly to support or help them recover. Companies simply do not emerge from them. Neither is meant to be a profit centre, both have made vast sums of money. How can they be making money out of support units of supposedly bankrupt companies? There is something very odd there indeed. The aim is to bankrupt the company or individual in order to seize their assets, which are worth vastly more than any possible loan. Legal companies run up huge bills at extortionate interest rates. I've seen several cases where purported loans, sometimes even below £20,000, have been used to seize people's houses and companies and assets worth vastly more than any possible loan. This has gone on, I believe, on an industrial scale, and nothing is done about it. When a company is taken down, the assets are usually far greater than the debt. I mean, the bank's not frankly worried about taking down a company that's in debt that hasn't got any assets. The ones they love are taking down companies that have massive assets on a very small loan and using, again, very forged documentation. As in the post office, there are financial incentives for managers to take down companies or individuals if it makes money. Fraud is almost encouraged within the banks if it makes money, and the managers are incentivized to do so. There is something very wrong with that. The cases often end up in civil courts. These courts seem to be in the pocket of the banks, and I find this extraordinary in this country. In spite of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, the judgment always goes in favour of the bank. Certain legal companies' names come up repeatedly in these cases. They're taken on by these particular companies. And there is evidence that certain judges, usually part-time judges in these civil courts, go out of their way to take on these particular cases. And there really does need to be an investigation onto why these particular judges take on these cases. And quite honestly, you haven't the hope if you end up in front of one of them, from all I've seen. One of the problems with major frauds is that no agency will take them on. The police do not have the expertise, time or money to take on a large fraud. Thames Valley Police had to take on over 50 outside accountants in the Lloyd H-Boss Reading case. I do not believe any major fraud has been taken on by the police since the Lloyd's H-Boss case. And that was started in about 2014, 2015. The regulatory authorities cover up rather than investigate when it comes to banks. The FCA will not take cases on. I had meetings and extensive correspondence with Andrew Bailey when I was PCC of Thames Valley and he ran the FCA. All cases had to go to him. and nothing ever emerged. A great number of cases in which fraud signatures were used were sent to the National Crime Agency. None were investigated. The NCA briefly looked into about 9 cases, and I think they'd chosen carefully. It said there was no clear fraud or forged documents. In none of these cases was the victim even interviewed. They were clear frauds. There was a close relationship between the head of the FCA and the head of the NCA. Both had worked closely together in the Bank of England. Every case involving a major bank was simply covered up. Lloyds Bank financially sponsored the National Crime Agency. Hardly surprising the NCA avoids investigating banks. Kevin Hollinrake, the minister now dealing with this area, wrote to the managing director of Lloyds, Otto Sorry, in September 2019, asking about the forged documentation being used by Lloyds' bankrupt customers. He asked that in all cases the bank desists from trying to take money from them. As far as I'm aware, the letter was ignored and the bank continued to pillage customers. I actually have his letter to them. That's a good letter. The SFO, the Serious Fraud Office, is too small to take on banking fraud and usually passes cases to other agencies. The Bank of England will not get involved. It protects the banks regardless. Its current governor, Andrew Bailey, of course, was in charge of the FCA and must have known perfectly well what was going on. The City of London Police no longer seems to investigate fraud in the city. That, I thought, was the main reason for its very existence in the first place. Practically all cases are sent to action fraud. The City of London Police are financially sponsored by Lloyds. Action Fraud is a call centre in Glasgow. It does not investigate fraud. The Times did a good expose of the sheer uselessness of Action Fraud. Action Fraud is financially sponsored by Lloyds. As far as I'm aware, nothing has been done to address the issues the Times highlighted. A few cases are sent down to the police forces to look into. They're quietly shelved, as far as I can see. It would be interesting to know how many cases have been sent to Action Fraud and how many actually resulted in an investigation. Vanishingly few, I believe. Another problem, of course, with the regulatory authorities are things like the Solicitors Regulatory Authority. I thought it was there to protect the customers. It seems to have forgotten that completely and is out there to protect its members, which was not the intention of it at all.
Even its big members.
Several of the most prominent players in all of this that I have seen now sit in the House of Lords. Some of them should be sitting in Wormwood Scrubs. There seems to be a serious problem with both the Insolvency Service and Land Registry. I'll not go through this in this presentation. There appears to be serious manipulation of both in favour of certain banks. The regulatory authorities, however strong the evidence of financial corruption within banking, pass the parcel between each other, and nothing is done. Until far clearer lines of responsibility are laid down, they will continue doing this. I sent a clear brief to the Prime Minister, Theresa May, in 2017, and I knew her well. She was an MP in my area, and she'd been Home Secretary. And she asked the PCCs, if anything really serious came up, to take it up directly with her rather than going public immediately. She passed the quite comprehensive brief I sent her straight to the Cabinet Secretary. And I'll just read out the correspondence I had with him. And it was actually quite extraordinary.
Read out in Parliament as well. I read it.
Well, and the letter said my brief was passed to the Cabinet Secretary by Theresa May. Let's find the right letter. Dear Mr. Stansell, thank you for a letter of 30th May 2017 to the Prime Minister about Lloyds Banking Group and the banking sector more widely. She asked me to reply on her behalf. I'm very concerned to read the extremely serious allegations set out in your letter, and I'm grateful to you for bringing them to the attention of the Prime Minister. I would strongly encourage you to pursue them formally through the proper channels, by contacting Andrew Bailey at the Finance Department. He can be reached, blah, blah, blah. Given the extremely serious allegations of your allegations, I'll keep a close eye on this matter and be happy to meet with you if you find it useful. I then wrote back to him a polite letter, and I said thank you for replying on the Prime Minister's behalf to my letter on banking frauds. My problem about dealing directly with the financial authority is that the current chairman was senior partner of KPMG, which audited the HBOS accounts and overlooked a massive fraud. And that was the Lloyds fraud, where several hundred million went walkabout. I would like a meeting with you, if possible, to show you some of the compelling evidence and discuss what should be done about it. I showed this to Mr. Gavin Barlow in your office on the 12th of June last, and he was absolutely horrified by it, I can tell you. I'm grateful if you could contact my office anyway. I then got back this letter. Dear Mr. Stansfeld, this from the Cabinet Secretary. Thank you for your recent letters. On the recommendations given to me in briefings on this case, I have decided that I'll be unable to meet you to discuss these matters. I would recommend you make contact with the Serious Fraud Office. Well, the Serious Fraud Office had turned down the HBOS Reading case, if you remember. Absolutely no point in getting onto them at all. Anyway, he was sent comprehensive briefs and absolutely nothing happened whatsoever. So that was a fairly fruitless exercise on my behalf. In both the Lloyds HBOS and in the Post Office inquiries, Post Office frauds, inquiries were set up. Inquiries now seem to have become a way to cover up major establishment wrongdoing. Unless an inquiry has a fixed date by which it must report, it will go on almost indefinitely at huge cost to the taxpayer and to the great financial advantage of the lawyers involved. Every inquiry should issue an interim report within 1 year. The victims are largely ignored. Even when the victims are eventually compensated or paid back the money stolen from them, the lawyers involved are paid far more than the victims usually. And it's usually taken from the compensation meant for the victims. That cannot be right. The Dame Linda Dobbs inquiry into what went on in Lloyd's HBOS has now entered its 7th year. That is the inquiry that the boss of Lloyds Bank told me would take a few months. It has published nothing. I asked Dame Linda for an interim report. My request was refused. Many of the victims who might have greatly assisted have since died or lived in abject poverty, and most of those responsible, in many cases criminally involved, have long since retired on their large pensions from the proceeds of their crimes. The Dame Linda Dobbs inquiry is paid for by Lloyds Bank. So much for independence. It is understandable that police forces do not have the resources to deal with banking fraud. However, some of them seem to be in the pockets of the banks and go out of their way to cover up on behalf of the banks. Avon and Somerset police are named by a considerable number of victims as being well aware of what has been going on, but cover it up, and Bristol is one of the major centres. From all I've seen, I would agree with that. I won't go into other police forces, but some of them do seem to have an over-familiar relationship with the banks. Too many smart dinner parties and smart occasions. And I won't go into that. Less than 2% of police budgets goes towards looking into fraud, yet it accounts for probably well over 100 times, maybe 1,000 times more than the amount lost to household burglary and other scams. It's not actually as though the police were any good at finding household burglary. Some police forces it's low as about 3 or 4% or something. What the hell are the police up to? You wonder sometimes. Fraud is a very low priority, and that attitude must be changed. It is extraordinary that Lloyds Bank financially sponsors the National Crime Agency, the City of London Police and Action Fraud. I'm sure it entertains the managers of those organisations very well, but it hardly gives them an incentive to investigate banking frauds claimed to have coming out of Lloyds itself. I've been describing a litany of corruption within the establishment of the banking world. I've somewhat concentrated on Lloyds, but NatWest, RBS are every bit as involved. There seems little push to sort it out, rather the opposite. What should be done about it? I'm somewhat cynical about another inquiry that will drag on for years. What is needed is a proper set of criminal investigations and prosecutions. I believe the Met Police, and an awful lot of this does emanate from London, should be totally reorganised. It's clearly, in my view, unfit for purpose. It needs breaking down into about 5 manageable sized police forces that deal with local crime and neighbourhood policing. There should be a central independent division that deals with serious organised crime and corruption, and a separate independent division that deals with major fraud. City of London Police should cease to exist and its local duties be put into another police force. The London Fraud Division should also be given responsibility and the finance, and that's the critical thing, for looking nationally into major banking and allied fraud in all UK police areas. Clear guidelines should be given to the regulatory authorities, notably the SFO, NCA and FCA, so that their responsibilities do not lag and the practice of passing the parcel between them each other can be stopped. I think my time has run out and I'll end there, but a great deal needs to be done to sort out the problems that are seriously damaging to the UK's reputation internationally. They're damaging the bedrock of our economy, our small and medium-sized companies, and ruining countless lives. Thank you very much.